Last year I was hiking in Shenandoah, Virginia. It was a planned 2-day hiking trip with myself and 2 friends. Late into the first day one of my friends grew ill and decided to turn back. The second friend joined him, just in case it got worse. They told me to go on, and seeing as I had been looking forward to the trip, I did. As evening approached I came upon a clearing in the forest. On a table, surrounded by tools and several cans of spray paint, was an elaborate dollhouse. It was large, perhaps 3 feet tall. Its walls and windows were open, as if it had just been built and was drying. That lingering smell of spray paint still hung in the air around it. On the back of the house a photo had been affixed. It was an old family picture, perhaps taken in the 80s. Everyone in the picture looked very uncomfortable, like they didn't want to be taking the picture, or were forced to. Not scared, just very uncomfortable. I left it and continued on so that I might reach my planned campsite by nightfall. The wind had picked up considerably. In the distance I heard a branch give and fall, crashing to the forest floor, startling me. I found my campsite but was a bit unnerved by the dollhouse in the middle of nowhere. I realized I didn't want to camp out in the open where whoever was working on it might stumble upon me. I had one of those little one-person tents that stand just tall enough for a person to lay down in. I set it up behind a thick stand of brush with one side blocked off by a tall stand of rocks. I was glad for this, because not only was I now hidden, but the rocks effectively blocked the heavy winds, which had now turned cold, as the frigid air tumbled down from the mountains at night. The sound of the wind-churned forest was relaxing, and I think I fell asleep right away. Have you even been awoken by a loud sound, and you're unsure what it was, exactly, but some remnant of it echoes in your mind for a moment after waking? That's what happened to me sometime later, in the pitch dark. I had the sensation that someone was near. I listened intently, trying to hear over the wind. I heard a man's voice somewhere in the distance. Harsh, rapid, then becoming softer. He was too far away for me to discern what he was saying, but close enough that I could hear inflection and cadence. It sounded like a crazy person scolding himself, and then his voice became softer, answering himself. As I listened his voice grew louder and louder, until I could hear his clumsy footfalls crashing towards me. He walked by where I was camped, just several feet away from the brush that concealed me. By now my eyes had adapted somewhat to the pale moonlight, but I still couldn't make out anything more than a large, massive shape. He was probably about 6 feet 6 inches and heavily built. He was carrying something long beneath his arm, a rolled-up tent I guessed. He was angrily talking about someone's face and how it haunted him. His voice then became childlike, and his conversation with himself turned to the topic of cheese and crackers. The dude was clearly off his rocker. Either that or he must be high on something real good. After a moment he continued on, his voice receding until I could no longer hear him. I slept little that night afterward. At first light, I booked it back the way I came and back to town. I noted that the dollhouse was not in the clearing when I passed back by. Whoever that stranger in the night was. I'm glad that we did not meet.
A couple of years ago, I went hiking alone on different trails in the Blue Ridge Parkway. For some reason I thought it would be okay for a 20-something woman to go alone. Stupid, I know. I always wanted to visit Mount Mitchell, so I made the trek up there. This was on a Monday, so there weren't a ton of visitors. The path to the summit is paved, so it's a fairly easy walk, but it's a bit steep. I was a smoker at the time, so I was quite out of breath. I finally got to the top and stood to the side trying to catch my breath, and I see someone step very close to me out of the corner of my eye. I look up and it's a man, probably in his late 40s, greasy, dark brown hair. He says, "Hey, I noticed you took a while to get up here and you're breathing really hard, are you okay?" I was kind of taken back, but I replied saying I was fine and that I'm a smoker, and I kind of laughed to make light of the situation. He stood there looking at me, so I made a little nod to let him know I was going to walk away. I walked over to podiums that show you the direction you're looking and what mountains and cities are that way in the distance. He followed me. He started talking out of nowhere about how he had recently been divorced and was part of a men's group that traveled around the country to lots of famous tourist spots. He asked where I was from and I told him. He proceeded to tell me really intimate details of why he got divorced. He told me how he suspected his wife was cheating on him, so he hid in the closet one night and caught her and a coworker in bed together. He grumbled, they both paid dearly for that night. I tried to make it visibly obvious that I was uncomfortable, but he kept talking and asking me questions without pausing to let me answer. I came to the conclusion that he was simply lonely and wanted someone to talk to. Then, I realized there was no one with him this entire time, and I hadn't noticed any men's group, but maybe they split up and went their separate ways for a while. At any rate, I became increasingly nervous, so I let him know I was going to head back down to the gift shop. Again, he started following me. There are lots of trails that branch off from the main path to the summit, but I wasn't interested in going on any of those since I was still so out of breath. I wasn't walking with the man now, but he was following me. He called out to me loudly, "Hey." I turned around and he was grinning ear to ear. His hair somehow looked even greasier. He said, "Why don't we go walking on one of these trails? I could show you a really good time." I replied, "No thank you," sternly. I looked to my left, and there were two elderly women sitting on a bench. I realized they had been watching us. One of the women called to the man, "I think it's time the young lady get going now." I gave her a soft smile and a nod. I turned around and walked at a brisk pace down the path, passing the gift shop, going straight to my car. The man hadn't followed me. That was my last hike of the day, and I'm glad that nothing worse happened while I was alone. I definitely don't go on outings like that by myself anymore.
A few months back, my girlfriend and I were bored hanging around the house and spontaneously decided to go out for a hike. We don't go hiking often, but the idea appealed to both of us, and even though there was only about an hour left of light, we figured we had enough time to go enjoy a hike before it got too dark. We quickly fill up our water bottles and put on the best walking shoes we had, and we were out the door, driving up into the mountains. Around my area there are many hiking trails, with the variety of trails increasing as you go up into the mountains. We tended to stay around the base of the mountains in the occasional case of us hiking, where most people would still be walking, but we wanted to change things up and progressed further up the mountain road to a trail a friend of mine had mentioned. We kept in mind our time and figured that we could hike for a bit and simply enjoy the new environment, and finish up before it was too late. We arrived at the trailhead and see that there were no cars left along the road where the trail commences, but didn't think much of it due to the time. We still had a good 45 minutes until dark, so we continued on. We start walking down a fairly steep hill that then recoups the elevation at the bottom with an equally steep hill that you have to ascend. We reach the top and then it's smooth sailing from there. We see a lone coyote off of the trail a ways off, and some rabbits, and I made a quip about how those rabbits might need to be careful with that coyote lurking around. She playfully hit me for that one. Approximately less than a mile into the trail, we see a large, fallen tree that made a bridge over a dried river bed and decided to climb around on it and take pictures. We're there for about 10 minutes, and then resume hiking. We continue on the trail for a short distance, until she hears a rustle in the trees behind us. We stop, mildly spooked due to the assumed size of whatever made that rustling, but continued on only briefly before she decides she's done and that we need to head back. It's twilight now, so I agree with her and we turn around to head back to the car. When we made it back to the fallen tree, my shoe had come untied, so I used the trunk to fix my loose laces, and looked behind us for the first time on the hike, uncharacteristic for me, but hey, I was having fun. Why be paranoid? I see a person dressed entirely in black with their hood on that was a significant distance behind us, walking at a slow, even pace. It wasn't something out of the ordinary, so what if they're wearing a black hoodie with their hood on? I wear black most of the time and it's cold out, I shouldn't make assumptions. This does trigger me to be more alert, however, and I inform my girlfriend of this person's presence. It's now dusk. We continue on at an intentionally faster pace and go through a winding section of the trail, and I lose sight of the person. When we come around the final bend of the section I figure they're far behind us and that there's nothing to worry about. Sooner than later the person is behind us again, but much closer. Probably 50 feet in comparison to 100 feet before, but we had increased our speed prior, so this alarmed us. We briskly walk around another bend, and as soon as we come around it, we book it. It seemed to be a natural reaction on both of our parts as we just started running without a word said to initiate it. We are nearing the trailhead now, with only the hills to deal with. We catch our breaths for a moment, and I turn around again. I see the person seemingly halt a sprint upon noticing me looking back. As if they were trying to uphold the illusion of simply walking. At this point I shout, "Go!" and we sprint down the hill. What little light was left struggled to make its way through the dense trees surrounding us, and the steep hill proved challenging to run down without a clear path to be seen. We both stumbled down the hill, almost falling multiple times and slamming our feet onto rocks and loose brush, but we didn't fall and we didn't look behind us. We make it to the bottom, but must continue up the initial hill and then we will have made it out. We persevere up the incline and make it back to our car. I briefly breathe in relief as I start my car, heart pounding and adrenaline racing. As I reverse onto the road, the person emerges at the trailhead, apparently breathing heavily. We finally get a glimpse of him. His hood had fallen off of his head, exposing his pale complexion and dead eyes that were only illuminated by a single lantern at the start of the trail. He was holding something in his hand, but it was too dark to see and I was not interested in sticking around to make out the object. I shift into drive and accelerate as fast as my car could muster, leaving him behind in the dust of the empty side of the road. Night Trail Stalker dude. Let's not meet.